Hello, everyone. We're just waiting a couple minutes as we let others call into the webinar here, and we'll get started in just a minute. All right, how are we doing for numbers? Are we still climbing, Andres?
No, go ahead, Karen, if you want to introduce, because we are ready.
Okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Karen Chauvin. I am the chair of the CIM's Environmental and Social Responsibility Society. Primarily, my job is to have our whole team work together and provide all kinds of interesting content for our community from everything environmental and social perspective. And, you know, we do everything from webinars to in-person events when we're allowed to do that again, conferences, stakeholder dialogues, and all of these lovely events. And well, we hope to see you guys all soon in person. Today, we're going to be working on our webinar platform. I'd like to introduce Andres Recalde, who is he's our working group director, and he helps to coordinate activities amongst our various working groups and pull together events on specific topics as well. And he's also very involved with our international community and bringing lots of topics forward to both Canada and then taking things abroad. So I'll let you take over, Andres. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andres Recalde. I really would like to express you my gratitude for your interest to hear about this presentation we prepared in order to honor Jan Boon's memory of his accomplishment over the years. I came to became familiar, a friend of Jan for many years. Well, we spent many events together, and always after those events, I keep receiving his inspiration about how to do best for mining and interacting with communities, governments, and others. So from that, I really admire his passion to see mining as an industry that is perceived better than it is perhaps now. But nevertheless, what we're doing today is an overview of all the different papers and academic work that Jan over the last 10 or so years developed in Canada and overseas. And I will give you a brief summary. We will have Robert Boutelier presenting in a moment this overview of Jan's intellectual professional evolution through a summary of his papers. And then we will continue with each one of our three panelists that they will bring some personal recollection and commentaries about Robert's and description of Jan's accomplishment professionally. So with nothing more, I really would like to pass the screen to Robert for him to present. 1 second, please. Okay, Robert, you can share your screen.
Okay, good. I guess you can see yourselves, and now I'll move to the PowerPoint. Good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Boutelier. I've been asked to summarize the publications that Jan Boon did on sociology of community relations. I'm a social psychologist and sociologist, so I'll go at it from that point of view. The things Jan published were his master's thesis, PhD thesis, and this brand new book that has just come out called Relationships in the Course of Social Events During Mineral Exploration, Applied Sociology Approach. And in that book, the main question he tried to answer was, how should we do corporate social responsibility in mineral exploration? And so he studied 9 cases and did over 220 interviews in 5 countries, which is a pretty broad survey of what's going on at exploration sites. There was 2 in Argentina, 1 in Canada, 3 in Ecuador, 1 in Mexico, here in Morelos, where I'm located right now, and a couple in Peru. He used a symbolic interactionism framework, which is a school of sociology, and it focuses on meanings, reference communities, relationship building, and transactional needs and identities. Verification and reinforcement of people's identities is one of the transactional needs they have. Other needs that people fulfill during transactions are the need to make sense of the world, to make meanings. So these are all related. And this is what it looks like. It's the symbolic interactionism framework. It's one of the oldest frameworks in micro sociology. It goes back to originally to George Herbert Mead in the 1930s, but then was updated and expanded by Herbert Blumer in 1969. And that was around the time that sociology was starting to realize that, you know, institutions don't actually exist. There's no such thing as the Parliament of Canada. There's just a building and a bunch of people with the same ideas in their head about what things should happen in what order. And that's why they can show up at the House of Commons and pass laws. And other people believe that those decisions have consequences that they should pay attention to. And so that's the reality, is that people are constructing order in their lives, but it's all in their heads, but it comes through interactions with each other. So it's not only in one person's head, it's through really central to it are relationships and interactions. So this is a school of micro sociology that tries to get down to the basic building blocks of social order and disorder. Using the model here that Jan reproduced in his book, we could start with change processes. Something changes, people need to make meaning of it, and then they need to figure out what it implies for them and what options they have. And then when they consider their options, some of them are maybe more ethical than others, so they have to apply normative considerations. Then there's a decision made and action taken, and that leads to more change. And the change processes, the meaning making, the interpretation of the situation are all affected by relationships and interactions. And that's one of the assumptions of symbolic interactionism, but they're also affected by this yellow block here called reference communities. And that means, for example, when a geologist, an exploration geologist, is making a decision, interpreting a new event, they'll say, well, what would my peers in geology think of this? How would they interpret it? And also when he has to make a decision over on the right here, normative considerations, what are my professional ethics that I have to pay attention to? And it's the same for everyone. So environmentalists their reference communities will be the people they met at the last global environmental conference, for example, or things like that. And people who live in villages where mining exploration is going on will think about reference communities like everyone else in the village, and perhaps the religious leader in the village, and so forth, when it comes to making normative choices. And so these things all connect with each other. But relationships and interactions are really quite important for all of them. Well, not all of them, 4 of them. You can see 4 arrows coming from that box. So it's quite a pragmatic method to interpret social interactions. It can be applied to anything. It's been applied to interactions in classrooms, interactions in hospitals, restaurants, businesses, inside organizations, political debates, and so forth. It's very, very elemental. It gets down to the basic building blocks of social structure. And so its concepts have had an impact on all of sociology because it is so basic. Now, it has had some critiques by sociologists, especially those interested in building a science of society. They claim that symbolic interactionism makes very few falsifiable predictions. And we got an example of that here from Jan's PhD thesis. From his abstract, he said it was found that relationships exert a significant influence on the course of social events and on the perceived present and future benefits and harms related to mineral exploration. You'll note that this was also assumed as part of the framework of symbolic interactionism right at the beginning here in this orange box. So it is assuming, he's concluding what he assumed at the beginning. So but that's not necessarily circular if you say that what was stated at the beginning was just a hypothesis. So if you treat this graph here as a hypothesis of relationships, well then, of course, it's not circular. But that then opens up symbolic interactionism to another common critique, is that, well, if you want to make predictions that are falsifiable, you have to get more precise. You can't just wander into a social situation and start to interpret it using your symbolic interactionist framework unless you take measures or somehow quantify it in a way that could prove yourself wrong. Otherwise, you're very wide open to what's called confirmation bias. You're likely to see what you expect to see. So if you go in there expecting relationships to be important, what do you know? You'll probably see that they are important through confirmation bias and not because of anything that could have been proven otherwise. And there's also self-fulfilling prophecy bias, where your behavior studying the social interaction elicits what you expect to see. Natural scientists don't have these problems. The things they study don't react to being studied, but very often. Yeah, there are exceptions, but so these things require that symbolic interactionists take move further towards quantifying what they're doing. And Jan Boon did do that. So he's got more specific and started making more specific claims about how relationships are important and what it is about relationships that's important. So in general, symbolic interactionism has been used as a starting point for other schools of sociology. One of the biggest these days is institutional theory, which kind of overlaps into areas of economics and political science as well. It's a huge thing. It's not just sociology. It's in the social sciences in general, and it specifies the unique circumstances where reference groups, for examples, and interactions are going to lead to norms and rules. So it gets more specific so that it can be proven wrong, and the observations can come out differently from what you expect when you go in with your hypothesis. So there's also social networks and social capital theories, which in sociology, which started off elaborating on things that symbolic interactionism said. They specify which patterns of relationships create meaning, norms, and collective actions, and which do not. Narrative analysis is another thing that grew out of or was influenced by, let's say, the origins in symbolic interactionism, and it's developed methods for carefully avoiding confirmation bias when you're analyzing an interaction. So today's sociologists view symbolic interactionism more as a framework than a theory. It's something, its premises permeate many approaches in sociology that have gone on to get more specific about the things that symbolic interactionism claims. And Jan Boon did that too. So he applied it to CSR in exploration projects, and there are when he did his literature review for his thesis in 2008 and 2011, he reviewed the academic critiques of corporate social responsibility, and the thing he found is, what everybody finds, the majority of them, of the critiques come from a critical theory point of view. And basically, to put it bluntly, they say that CSR is designed to maintain a system of neoliberal exploitation and oppression. So it's just window dressing. It's kind of greenwashing, pinkwashing, and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of academic literature saying that. And at the time Jan was writing these literature reviews for his thesis, Hugo Chavez was actually raising living standards in Venezuela. They were going up at that time. And by eradicating neoliberalism through Bolivarianism. And so that seemed to validate those academic critiques. But, and so around the same time too, this wave of, sometimes it's called the pink tide, Bolivarianism went through Latin America. Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, Lula da Silva in Brazil, ascending to power. Rafael Correa was in Ecuador and Evo Morales in Bolivia. But by 2014, there was, the Ecuadorian constitutional crisis. Evo Morales was fooling around with the Constitution too. He was only allowed to run twice, and by the time he left, he was on his fourth election campaign. Cocaine involvement, especially in the Morales government, that came to light after he left. the car wash scandal for Lula. He was by 2014 on trial and eventually went to jail for the corruption with the car wash scandal. So all of the hopes for defeating neoliberalism as the answer were dashed by then. And by 2015, Jan had done his field work and he found that those academic critiques that blamed it all on neoliberalism were not very useful for explaining what actually happens when you get down to the village level and see what's happening around an exploration project. And they're also not useful for strategizing about how to improve the situation. So instead, Jan produced a practical toolkit for companies to help guide them on the road to CSR in a way that would deliver a shared value for everyone. Although I don't think he used the term shared value. That's another school of stakeholder management. But these here from table 3-1 in his book are the specific elements of relationships that he identified as important through all of his interviewing and careful study of what was going on in those interviews. Number one is trust. Those relationships, you have to develop trust in those relationships, and when it's not there, it's very hard to advance. So you have to be believed despite uncertainty, and trusting involves risk-taking and becoming vulnerable, taking chances by trusting others first, being the first to extend trust and things like that. Respect, very important. As Jan found that you need to that's something that has to be a characteristic of all the interactions with stakeholders. Communication, especially on the side of everyone feeling like they've been heard, like listening. You could just as well substitute the word listening there because that's such an important part. But also communication involves saying things in plain language rather than technical language. Mutual understanding. So there's the element of mutuality in relationships that builds trust and shows respect. So these things get interconnected, but it is an important element in its own right. Conflict resolution, like having the mechanisms there and using them for resolving conflicts, like grievance mechanisms and things like that. Goal compatibility, and this, of course, gets right down to the nub of a lot of conflicts. Is that, well, we want to do different things with this land, or we want to do different things with this water. And so this is where you have to face those incompatibilities and find a way that everyone can get what they need. And sometimes you have to redefine the goals more broadly for that to happen. The balance of power in the relationship is very important. And the cases he studied, there were different balances of power. Like in the Andes, the high Andes, I think it was Argentina, there exists legal protections of the communities to give them control over the use of their land. And so the balance of power is much more equal there, and things went much more smoothly there because that huge power gap didn't obstruct the development of trust and mutuality. Focus, you have to be clear about what matters and who should be involved. You can't have, where there's riches involved, the promise of wealth, there will be people try to insert themselves. So that's what that is about. Frequency is about, having enough interaction more frequently enough. But also whether it's positive or negative, the relative balance of positive versus negative interactions. Stability as a degree of predictability. Some of the situations he studied were more predictable for the future than others, and productivity, of course, degree of achievement of target results is something that is important, especially on the company side of the relationship. But in those communities where they want jobs, they also want to see things moving along. So this is very practical for managers of exploration projects. And it also takes a symbolic interactionism approach exactly where it needs to go, to the point where you can make specific predictions about what's going to be important and what's going to make a difference. So that's, yes. And then he assigned numbers to each of these factors, added them up, and created this matrix. This is just from one of the projects that he studied. And so he had 5 levels here, red, orange, light green, medium green, and dark green. And the dark green are the most positive relationships using his toolkit here. So they were positive on all of these elements. And the red one there was conflict. So when you add up quantification of all the elements that Jan identified, you are able to say which relationships are going to have conflict in them and which ones are going great. So this is as far as he got. I think if he'd had more years to do more study, he would have gone even further. What other sociologists do with a matrix like this is do a social network, because that's exactly the data that feeds into a social network. And so this is the same graph. This is this matrix, and the numbers in it, and the implied by the colors, turned into a network graph. So it's an example of how symbolic interactionism actually has led to these other schools of sociology. There's the negative relationship there that he found on this graph here in the first column, 12th row. And the height of these nodes on this network graph indicates how well connected they are to well-connected others, which is something that you can quantify and get a number for that. You can also, with this approach, go even further with quantification, because you can quantify who's more of a bridging person, who's more central within a cohesive group, and identify other features of graphs that allow you to compare one graph of one project to graph of another project, or compare how a project is doing across time. This next graph here is the same thing, just looking at the 2 strongest levels of relationships. So you can see that and this tells you exactly what Jan said in the text of his book, where he described that matrix there. He knew the data so well, it was like he had this graph in his head, because he had memorized what everyone had said, and it's very close to the data. So he did talk about the parish council being the most influential. That's what this graph shows too. So he had that, but with this type of quantitative approach, you can get that information at a glance. Okay, so to summarize Jan's contributions, relationships make a difference. And I think that that's an important thing for, I mean, although it was something that is really stated as a founding hypothesis in symbolic interactionism, it's not always given full account in managing exploration projects. So these insights have to be applied, and he provided the tools for applying them. So whatever the geopolitics, individuals make meaning, and everyone has social responsibilities, not just corporations. So that was another interpretation of corporate social responsibility that Jan emphasized, is that it's not just corporate responsibility. For this to work for everyone's benefit, everyone's got responsibilities they have to take up, including government. And in his case studies, he found that to be a problem in some cases. Relationships also are conditioned by laws and local history. Well, that refers back to the reference groups and so forth that you see in the symbolic interactionism chart. But he found, this is even more important than symbolic interactionism would lead you to think. So he's starting to move here in the direction that others went when they moved into institutional theory. Institutional theory will talk about how decisions made in the past will limit the choices available in the present and things like that, or condition the choices made in the present. And he started to see that. So his development of a toolkit for exploration project managers to assess relationship conflict, the potential for it, to predict it, was very, very practical advice. And I recall having dinner with Jan at a conference. I ran into him at many conferences, and he mentioned the importance of ethics in corporate social responsibility. And I, at the time, didn't have the framework in my own head to pursue that further, but I wish I could have asked him just how he would have resolved the conflict between, on the one hand, treating all projects as completely unique and bearing their own criteria for corporate social responsibility versus, on the other hand, going in the end, that's a sort of relativism, ethical relativism, right? So it's saying we can't decide what's responsible behavior in general. But on the other extreme, you do that, where you say, here are the 10 principles of corporate social responsibility that apply to all cultures, all places, at all times. And that's a kind of cartoonish extreme of the opposite of relativism. It's an absolutism. We're always trying to tread that fine line between those extremes. And I think, having read his work, Jan was moving towards combining them through the emphasizing relationships, because they are something that is universal and yet specific to each situation. They combine both. If you get the relationships right, you'll have taken account of all of the specifics of a situation. But at the same time, human relationships are the same across history and across cultures. That's why we can understand stories and myths from other cultures, because They're talking about people interacting with each other and having certain relationships with each other. We understand all that. It is universal. So if you look at the relationships in an abstract enough way, you can extract the universality from them as well as the specificity. So it seems to me that's where he was heading, but I wish I could have asked him. Well, that's it for me. So on to comments now. I hate to stop sharing here. Is that it? Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Robert. Now, please feel free. You can use the option to make questions, writing. But I will pass the microphone to Bernarda. Let me describe briefly about our panelists today, Bernie, Dominique, and Luke. So Bernarda Elizalde is known internationally and particularly in Latin America for her on-the-ground experience at the sites of exploration projects and mining operations, promoting responsible business practices, training, and contributing to the understanding between local communities and the extractive sector for mutual benefit. While assuming the position of Program Director of Sustainable Development at PDOC during 2008 and 12, Bernarda provided leadership and expertise to the organization expansion and influence in corporate social responsibility with industry, governments, and special interest groups across Canada and into the international arena. She has intimate knowledge of national and international mining standards, conventions, and guidance based on work with international institutions, mining, and exploration companies, and engaging with a variety of stakeholders groups. She was the key force behind the development and management of E3+, a framework for responsible exploration, the first corporate social responsibility guidance of its kind for the exploration industry. She also initiated and successful the CSR event series at PDOC convention, creating a space for the industry and other interested stakeholders to discuss sustainability matters. Well, welcome, Bernie, for your commentaries to what we have heard from Robert.
Oops.
One second, let me change this. Yeah. So, sorry, Bernie, you need to, one second.
Unmute.
Yeah, Bernie, you need to unmute yourself. No, you need to unmute.
There?
Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andres, for your introduction. Thank you, everyone, for your interest to attend this gathering, I would call it. I would start describing Jan as a professional and how I met Jan and how we converged in our paths. So Jan, as Robert was describing, he had an immense curiosity as a geologist, and then developed his passion for CSR. And so it became his second career. And Jan was started to be seen almost as a sociologist. He could see things from a different point of view of other people that other people couldn't see. It's not that easy for people who are not that familiar with social matters to understand how all these sociological theories become a reality on the ground. When we're trying to apply them, how difficult, how easy, or how complex can they be? So Jan, while we were working at the PDAC developing E3+, Jan was the most avid volunteer to review the documents that we had to develop. We had to organize different committees to review different documents, and there were quite a number of documents and topics from governance, project due diligence, community engagement, community development, and so on. And sometimes I wouldn't hear from other volunteers, but the only one who would always say, here I am with his helpful comments and suggestions, that was Jan, always Jan. So I could rely on his thoughtful remarks. And during the PDAC convention as well, you have the auditorium full of people. And when it comes to questions, it was always Jan at the microphone making his questions. He always had a question to ask. It was his curiosity, and he would usually make philosophical questions or remarks. He was very well respected in Latin America. So wherever I would go in Latin America, I would find his footprints, and it was so nice to hear very good comments about him and the work that he had done, and how people could understand corporate social responsibility through his eyes as well. So that was very nice. And as a good Dutch, and I'm not sure if you recognize this Luke, he would always find a way to find the cheapest way for this or that. No, he said, you know, Bernard, I found this was that's cheaper than that one, and it was always the cheapest. So he would make a joke, and he would say, hey, Bernarda, do you know how the copper wires were invented? No, Jan, how? And he said, well, it's two Dutch men fighting for a coin. And he would most often make me laugh with that joke. But well, now I would like to highlight how Jan helped to illuminate some key aspects of community relations and how they are applied on the field. And if Andres or perhaps Robert can help me to bring up the slide number 7 from the presentation that you gave, Robert.
Yeah, okay. I don't have control of the screen, so.
Okay.
Or maybe Andres or Andres.
Yeah. I will back to. Okay, you can share your screen now, Robert.
Okay, number 7. Which one was that? I don't have
the table. You want the table?
The one before, the one with the list of the that one.
This one. Okay.
So there are different aspects of CSR that are very that are seen from the sociological side, and there are even areas of sociology that I didn't even know they were called like that, like microsociology. You hear from microeconomics, now you hear from microsociology, and you see all the complexity of all these factors. And for people who are not sociologists, it becomes like something sometimes complex to understand, but at the same time easy when you can find the key factors that you have to work with. So we can see on this slide that Robert developed and the key aspects that Jan was highlighting as the ones to build up relationships. I would like to give you examples of how they were applied on the ground as a practitioner first. So as a practitioner, you go to the field and you need to understand in order to show respect, which is the second one on the list. To show respect, you have to do your due diligence before you go to the field. And I'll give you a very good example of why I encountered. So once I was working with a mining company in Colombia, and this mining company is located around an area where you have a very interesting ethnic group called the Wayús. The Wayús have their house, if you go to a Wayú community, you see the houses of the Wayú organized like in a semicircle, and in the center of this semicircle, there is a little hut. When you get to that community, what you have to do is that you have to go to that little hut, wait there for the authority to see you through the window or from wherever he is. And if he decides to greet you, come out and greet you, then you're okay and you can start talking to them. If not, you have to just leave. So when I got there, I knew that I had to do that. So things went very smoothly. But if you don't know those small details and you go there and you knock on the first door, you're obviously making a bad first step and a bad first impression.
And usually the first impression is the one who carries on through time. So that's what Jan was trying to explain, and practitioners try to explain to different people who go on the ground and to creation teams, that it's so important to know where you go, who are you talking to, do your due diligence, so show respect. Because when you show respect, then you have a mutual understanding, and then you build trust. And when you build trust, then things go much better. So that was one example of things that for some people who hear the S part of corporate social responsibility can sound abstract, but they are not. They're actually part of our daily lives. Why? Because we're human beings, and as human beings, we relate. We relate to each other, and as institutions as well. Just like we relate between different people, institutions and organizations also need to relate. But how do we understand those relationships? And how else does respect surfaces as your way of showing and demonstrating that you're interested to build up that relationship? Another example is in my experience working with Torex now as well. So you can show respect in many different ways. And there are even indicators that tell you whether you have a good relationship or not. For example, you go on the car and you wave to people. If people don't wave back, well, that's not a good sign, right? If people wave back, it means, yeah, hello, I'm not unhappy that you're here, no? So there are different indicators. And one thing is to show respect by saying hello to people. And it goes through a variety of different ways of showing that respect. And I would say that one that goes to the highest levels is to show respect by helping the community members to be part of the decision-making process, to helping them participate in the decisions that you take. So with the work that we've done, that I've done with Torex, we understood that after some experiences that we had, and Jan explains that as well. He also says that societies have norms and they have procedures. And how do you follow those norms and procedures? And how does that create a predictability on what are you doing well and what not? And also in relationships, the cause and the effect of what you do or stop doing. So in our case, we decided to sign these community development agreements, which helped us to balance the power, to have a better mutual understanding, to manage expectations, to create more stability in the level of predictable outcomes of what we were expecting. So as you see, I am naming many of the factors that Jan was talking about and what he was trying also to contribute to the conversation. It has also been very interesting to see through the years how CSR has evolved. It has gone from trying to understand what corporate social responsibility, that has had also different names throughout the years too, has evolved now into what we know and call ESG. And how is ESG understood, and how does that bring us back to CSR, and understanding as well that CSR is the audience, the main audience of CSR are communities, companies, NGOs, governments, and other interested stakeholders. ESG is mainly developed by the finance sector and what is material for the finance sector, and also how companies answer to that. So in this evolution as well, it was very difficult in the very beginning to try to understand, or try to, how Jan did in the very beginning, trying to quantify the relationships. That was perhaps one of the most difficult tasks that we had as practitioners, to try to demonstrate that what we were doing was going somewhere. Because having a relationship expresses in different ways. One of the ways is through the social license to operate. but it also has its internal complexities, and it also says different things to different people. So with the KPIs that have been developed today, we are where we are, and with ESG and CSR as well. So, well, this is all just to highlight the contributions of Jans to all the work that we've done. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you for your commentaries. And I like very much also, I have many anecdotes with Jan myself, but I would not like to share because you have made a good representation of what his sense of humor and curiosity are remarkable. But anyway, we will continue with Dominic. Dominic, I will change to be you the presenter. 1 second. Okay. Okay, let me introduce Dominic to you, please. 1 second. Dominic Chener is currently Vice President, Community Relations at Kinross Gold Corporation, with responsibility for community relations strategy across Kinross mines and projects at the company's sustainability reporting. Prior to this role, held since January 2016, Dominic had spent all his professional career in South America. He has been with Kinross since 2008, based in Ecuador until late 2015, where he held various roles, including Vice President of Ecuador. From 2006 to 2008, he was the country manager in Ecuador for Aurelian Resources. From 1994 until 2006, Dominic worked in Venezuela with Guanamino Mining Company, a private diamond exploration group. He has a PhD in geology from the University of Toronto in 1994 and a BA and Master of Arts in geology from the University of Oxford. Welcome, Dominic, and please welcome your remarks.
Great, thanks very much, Andres. Can you see my screen okay? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Dominic, we can hear you.
Yeah, and can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, perfect. Great, so thanks very much, Andres, and thanks for the invitation to be on the panel today. Yeah, just sort of following from some of Bernardo's comments about Jan, just to share my connection with Jan. So I first met him when he came down to Ecuador to do the field research for his PhD in sociology. And so, you know, he was introduced to us by the Canadian Embassy, and you know, at that time, Kinross had the Fruta del Norte project, and you know, this was one of the field areas that he worked on for his research, and Robert had some of the results of that in his slides, and so that was the beginning of a lasting relationship. We became really good friends over the years, and stayed in contact as he was writing up his PhD. Working on developing the relationship tool that Robert described. You know, we presented a few papers together, Jan presenting the theory and myself talking about the FDN sort of part of the story. And then, you know, as I said, we kept in touch over the years, and he came to Kinross a number of times to give workshops with our community relations teams, and really helped us as we took his practical tool and then sort of adapted it and turned it into something for our teams to use on the ground, which they're now doing across all of our operational sites. And I'd sort of like to talk about that a bit. But really, Jan, he was just a wonderful, kind, decent man, and definitely miss him. Used to get together every time I went over to Ottawa on business. And so it's really nice to be remembering him and just to talk about his work and his contribution. And so, you know, my role at Kinross now is community relations, and I think that second word, relationships and relations, is something that, you know, Jan really made an important contribution. For myself, as somebody with a geological background, at that time I didn't really know much about sociology at all. You know, this was a real insight into sort of unpacking that word. Relations and relationships, and sort of seeing what are the various pieces which actually make up a strong, sustainable relationship. And what we did is we worked with Jan's thesis and worked with Jan, and so did a lot of discussions around, well, how can we sort of get this into something which our people can use on the ground on a daily basis. The screen that I'm sharing, it's from our recent sustainability report, and it sort of captures the way, the slight tweaks that we made to it to use. And so we saw it as a bit of a process, and you can see that flow chart on the top. Really starting with some of the things that Bernardo was talking about. Respect it's like the point of entry into starting a relationship, and so that's why we had that, along with communication through listening, sort of true dialogue, and really understanding the balance of power in a relationship. And balance of power is a fascinating part of a relationship. An example of that. In Chile right now, we have a lot of engagement going on with indigenous communities related to a permitting for a project we're advancing there, and that piece of the relationship has been a really important part of how we've worked with the community in terms of focusing on building governance capacity in the community as a key part of ensuring that as we move ahead in the dialogue, each party in the relationship has got an equal influence on the other in terms of working towards the outcomes of the relationship. Intimacy or friendship is something which wasn't in the table in Jan's thesis, but it's something that he brought in later on. And I remember talking with him about it, where he felt that it was, at the beginning, he hadn't sort of included it, feeling it wasn't like a sort of a key component. And you can have a sustainable working relationship where perhaps there may not be a significant degree of affection, but I think at the end he started to think this was actually something which obviously adds a lot of value to making a relationship stronger and work better for both parties. Robert talked about sort of what you might call sort of the engine room of a relationship, which is just the frequency of interaction and the stability, and the ability to resolve conflicts. I think this was a really important part of Jan's model, which shows that conflict happens in all relationships between people, and the key thing is to have the mechanisms in place to surface that conflict and deal with it, and ideally use that to actually strengthen the relationship. And if you sort of move on through the process, we saw sort of trust really as the defining outcome of the relationship. So all of these other things were working towards the outcomes of the relationship, which is a measure of trust. And in terms of just the ongoing execution of the relationship, we saw productivity. That is, are we achieving the results? From the community side, are they getting what's been agreed, what's been discussed, what's been committed in terms of the results of the relationship? And from the company side, are things moving along so that the business can advance, the permitting can advance, whatever the objective might be. But at the end of the day, trust really is the measure of the quality of the relationship. And so we turned this into, rather like Robert showed for that matrix for FDN. We turned it into just an Excel-based sort of matrix, again with scoring and sort of heat map type of thing, so that we can see, especially where we've got a more complex kind of situation, what's going well in the relationship, what's not going well, which are the areas where we need to focus on in order to improve just the overall quality of the relationship. So really, this has been, just a fundamental use for us in our company, in Kinross. We have this sort of baked into our what we call our SRP, our Site Responsibility Plan. That's the Kinross Management System for Community Relations. So this is now just an embedded part of the way we do community relations, and it's something we continue to work on, continue to use to develop our understanding. I think looking ahead, we've got more thinking to do on the reference community part of Jan's work. We haven't really sort of thought so much about that so far. And then also the network analysis as well. I think those are areas for us to look ahead. And so just as a sort of final comment, one of the things that we're working on with Jan was supporting him in translating his book into Spanish, and that's a pending project for completion. And so I'm looking forward to getting back to that, and hopefully we can help get his work published in Spanish, because I think it will just make that work available to a really significant sort of group of people. Thanks, Andres.
Good, thank you, Dominique. So, yes, a little commercial, but I just received a copy of the book in English.
Oh, okay.
So it's good that you're planning to help to have this in Spanish, because it will be really enhance the level of useful for practitioners in Latin America as well. Thank you, Dominique. Now I will give the screen to Luke. Well, let me introduce Luke for a moment, please. Okay. Luke Sandier is a director of Triple R Alliance, a small collective of experts who support companies, communities, and civil society groups operating in frontier markets with their stakeholder engagement approaches. His approach is based on 20 years of observing patterns in community stakeholder dynamics. This clarifying that such dynamics manifest themselves differently in each context, but are they highly predictable and in most cases preventable. Lutz has conducted over 130 site visits in 25 countries with 30 companies, mainly in the oil, mining, and renewable industries. These visits have involved the development of implementation of engagement and social investment strategies, establishing social performance functions during early stage operations, coaching of senior staff, social performance assessment, implementation of grievance mechanisms, and training for community staff. Thank you, Luke, and I will not take more longer to your presentation.
Thanks, Andres. Just checking, you can see the screen?
We can see your screen, Luke. Yes.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Yeah, my experience with Jan has been mainly during the conferences, and I had to smile when Bernarda mentioned that during PDAC meetings, Jan would always have the question, sometimes the only question, was always a good question. And I really enjoyed the conversations, and in particular his curiosity. I thought it was just remarkable that he did his PhD during, as a mature and individual and expert, and having a career behind him. And but it was always this, asking the hard questions, sharing information, and I really that was inspirational. And what I wanted to focus on is how he has inspired a generation of practitioners like myself in terms of better understanding company community dynamics. And you might think, company community conflict, is that rocket science? Well, actually, if it was that easy, then we wouldn't see the messy situations that we see still on many sites, including exploration project, but also during operations phase. And why it's still so difficult to actually identify companies or even sites that can actually demonstrate that that they actually have left the community better than they found it, and that is still a challenge. And therefore, there's still a lot of misunderstanding. And I would like to focus on, and I will use Robert's presentation, two key findings that for me have been kind of key contributions for Jan. In terms of better understanding and kind of clarifying some of these the assumptions that we held, and that we collectively hold, and that sometimes are incorrect and lead to problems. So the first one is about this flowchart that's in Jan's book and that Robert presented, and that's for me is a real key one, because how often do we hear in the field that managers say, listen, the community got the facts wrong, right? If we only tell them the factual, the reality, or what the objective reality, then they wouldn't behave the way they do. And over, people like us who work with companies, we say, well, actually, their perception is your reality. It doesn't matter from a company, from a conflict sensitivity perspective. if local perceptions are right or wrong. Ultimately, they go to the media, they go to politicians, they march to the gates, and they say, well, we think you're arrogant, or we think you're not transparent, or we think A or B or C. And I think it's always been a bit of a challenge to, and that's a real challenge, because as long as you think as a manager working on some of these mine sites that company community conflict is unpredictable because people's behavior is unpredictable, and that you can't really understand whose grandmother was fighting with whose grandfather 50 years ago, and therefore there is no point in trying to actually understand it and to manage for it, you leave yourself as a company very vulnerable to making mistakes, which then reinforces that cycle of ongoing company community conflict. And what Jan has done with this model is to say, this is the reality. Decisions and actions, and let me go to the next slide. So it's your perception based on your reference communities and your relationship and who influences you and who you speak with and what your neighbors think and what the politicians say and the activist groups say, that actually determines the decisions and the actions, that your behavior basically, that determines if you are going to work with a company or work against the company. And that is being a tremendously helpful model, because now we can actually visualize that what we implicitly already knew by talking to people, but now we have something to go to corporate management to say, this is actually how it works. And this is why you should not focus on the facts, because even if you're factually correct, it doesn't help you understanding how to solve conflict with local stakeholders. And it is also very practical, because if you assume that perceptions rather than facts drive behavior, it allows you to do a few things, and that's been Jan's contribution. First is you need to understand what are the power relationships, the relationships that people have and the power relationships between them, right? So if you talk about relationships and interaction, that pink box, that has now allowed us to do, for example, simple things like you don't have a stakeholder analysis or a stakeholder map where you map people with regards to their positions towards the company or towards a project. Nowadays, it is kind of a common practice to say that's only part of the game, mapping stakeholders. What we really need to understand much better is how they all related to each other and who has power over whom, so that we actually start much better, we start engaging in a much better, a much more strategic manner in terms of influencing those that have some particular positions, and then also better understanding why some stakeholders that you feel come out of the blue, why do they have a certain perspective. Second, what it allows us to do is to not focus so much on what people say, what their interests, so what their positions are, but to actually really understand what are their underlying interests, what makes them tick. Is it a power issue? Is it do people want to be respected? Do they have concern for the impact on the larger community, and they want to advocate as a community on behalf of the larger community? What is it? So it allows us to dig deeper and scratch the surface, because of course many companies say, well, they said something or they wanted something, we gave it to them, and then they changed their mind. And of course now we know what people say is not always what they mean, right? Because it is the difference between positions and interest. And then the third one, which I think is a real important one, is that we often that, like we all do, our I'm working largely with companies, so company policies and practices is very much driven and informed by the corporate assumptions. And very often these corporate assumptions are implicit, they're not explicit. So for example, the term corporate social responsibility is changed over time, and now typically we associate it with community social investment and community projects. Often there is still a corporate assumption that we talk about respect. Yeah, how do you quantify that? How do you do that? So companies often still feel like, yeah, it maybe is important and trust is important, but what people really want is stuff like projects, like livelihood replacement projects or local infrastructural projects like clinics and schools. That's still being done and is still being built. And then there is in some cases that is effective. In other cases, there is still a recognition that didn't really help in terms of the company community relationship. And the community say, well, we like the particular individuals who are working with us on those projects, but we still don't like the company. So the assumption that that social investment or community project is actually an effective conflict resolution tool needs to be checked. And what Jan's model does is to basically say, check our assumptions and check the assumptions with the community, because if not, we go down a rabbit hole, and then at the end of the day we wonder why we find ourselves in trouble. So that's the first contribution, in my opinion, that I have found very helpful. The second one builds on the same framework that Bernarda was mentioning, and I want to focus here, and I really like the fact that Jan was a pioneer in the quantification of social networks and social and conflict assessments. What I wanted to focus on is that I want to connect that slide that I just presented in terms of the matrix to this table, because what has been hugely beneficial is that by distilling these key elements and hearing the value that it has provided to an organization like Kinross, I think is phenomenal. But what he really did is to say, well, when companies say, well, behavior is unpredictable and it's all informed by local perceptions and who you talk to, we can't plan for that. We don't know who's talking to whom and who's influenced by what kind of group or perspective. Jan then combined that with this list of kind of key indicators, right? And we just heard how valuable that has been. And by doing that, what he's effectively done is to make that what appears unpredictable, human behavior, to make it actually very predictable. To say it doesn't really matter on a field, on a site-based level, who you talk to or what you have, who you have been influenced with, who you have been influenced by. What you really need to do is to discuss and to unpack what those key elements that are listed here, what it actually means, right? And that is actually very practical, because if you say, behavior is driven by perceptions, a general manager would say, so what? That's all nice and well, but what can I do with that? Yet, if you distill it, it allows you to, for a certain level of predictability, because what Jan has said, has this, identified based on his research, that these are the key elements. And then the next step is to make that super predictable, because then basically it allows you to go to the community and to say, trust. Trust, we know that trust is important. What does trust mean in an Ecuador context? What does trust mean when IKEA is going to open up a new store in Toronto? What does trust mean when we look at a forestry project in BC or in Madagascar, right? And that's been very valuable, because we know that these elements now are critical, but we also recognize that they are very context specific. So it has allowed us to say, let's focus on those key elements, and let's ask the question to local people and to local stakeholders to talk about, what do we do about that balance of power? And what is your goal and what is our goal? And therefore, what he has done is show the road, show the way in terms of what's the journey you need to get on in order to move to a relationship that is compatible, but also where you can check in along the way to say, how are we doing in our relation? And again, that kind of has made it much more tangible for many companies to wrap their head around, what does it mean to create a synergy between, corporate operations and community interest. I'll leave it there, Andres. Back to you.
Thank you. Look, we have one question from one participant. This is for Robert. Robert, the question is for you, and I will read the question because I don't know why I cannot transfer to you. But Dr. Boutelier, thanks for your presentation. Okay, in organizational studies, there is a new framework that can be helpful to solve the conflict between universality and relativism in CSR. It's called the paradoxical approach. I don't know, Robert, if you can answer this or comment paradoxical approach.
No, I don't know anything about it.
Okay, don't worry. I know
that sounds like more of a...
This question is from, let me see who is asking this. Okay. I will forward the question and the email of the person who asked, and you can answer later, Robert. Maybe he can describe more to you. Okay, we have Karen. Karen, are you back or not? Well, we don't have Karen, but anyway, thank you very much for your participation. We have, oh, yes, here's Karen. Here's Karen, please, Karen.
Yeah, sorry, I see a few more questions, Andres, if you scroll down maybe.
I see only one. I see only one. Can you maybe?
Okay, yeah, there's a question about, can you summarize what are the major issues associated with CSR? You know, are they centered on, you know, there's a long list here, tailings, mine discharge quality, air and effluents, local airshed and receiving creeks, waste rock dumps, etc. Like, what would your comments be on the major issues that are surfacing at this point in time?
So who could answer? Robert, can you answer that or comment, Luke?
Go ahead, Luke.
Sure. Well, it's a big question. First of all, I think there's a change in, like I think Bernarda and Dominique mentioned. There's a bit of a change in terms of how we talk about CSR in these days. And I would say that there's been an evolution. We now see this field as a real discipline. And I would argue, and that's debatable, but I think in many ways, many companies, when they talk about CSR, they talk now more about a fairly narrow set of activities that is related to social investment. So, community-focused projects. And I think one of the key, and I would say that that's one element of a larger set of activities, which I would, and again, this is all very much in flux, I would define as social performance. And social performance is really focused on three things. It is minimizing the negatives, it is optimizing the benefits, and it is ongoing engagement. And that resettlement and influx management and grievance mechanisms and human rights impact assessment is all part of that bigger picture of social performance. And then you have the larger picture, which is ESG, right? So that includes the governance piece and then the environmental piece. So key issues. So my area is mostly the social performance piece, and there's a number of key issues, but one is that that we now are very much recognizing, similar as with the safety concern, that if you look at impacts on local communities, if you look at the benefits of local communities, this has to be, it must be an integrated and cross-departmental approach. It is not something that can be identified to or can be delegated to a specialized department. But if you want to talk about conflict resolution and focus on some of the issues that Jan mentioned, 60–70% of all the complaints or grievances that companies receive are self-inflicted, right? It is late payment, it is hiring jobs for, hiring local people, hiring outsiders for people, for jobs that local people say they're entitled to. So it is really about its driving behaviors of contractor. So contractor management and how the involvement of communities in tailings dams or local contracting policies, that really is not something where a community relations or a social performance department is in control. It requires you to constantly force internal collaboration with different departments to say, this is a shared responsibility. We're all in this together. right? And the example is that if you walk into any mine site and you come to the reception and there is a loose wire, electrical wire, anybody would say, oh, that needs to be, that, you know, from a safety perspective, that's very unsafe. And anybody, when it's from the general manager to the secretariat to the gardener, they will identify that as a shared responsibility. What we need to get at, and we're on that journey, but it is a slow one, is to get that same kind of awareness that conflict prevention and conflict prevention by and large is a shared responsibility between everybody in the organization. No matter where you are, if you treat your staff that is from the local community poorly, that will have an impact on how local people feel about you. Because where the local people get their perspectives, they go to the neighbor and they say, hey, you're working with a company, how are they, right? Yeah. So I think that's one of the challenges.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yes, Bernie. Yes, Bernie, go ahead.
Can't hear you.
One second. Okay, Bernie, you need to unmute, or I need to make you the panelist. 1 second.
There should be a button that you can click.
Yes, yes, I am making Bernie the panelist. Okay.
Just while we're waiting for Bernie, just to follow on what Luke was saying about internal engagement and alignment. It's a key thing, and so and I think just bringing it back to Jan's model, it's relationships, right? It's relationships between different departments, and relationships take work, and so one of the things that our community relations teams track is the number of internal CR engagements they have, and we sort of put that as a performance metric precisely to the point that Luke was mentioning, because it helps them focus on something which is really important to build awareness and alignment internally across a range of issues. Bernard, are you back on volume? No, not yet.
No, I don't know what happened, Bernie. Sorry. Okay.
Shall we move to the next question? There's a few here. Okay, so here it says, one curiosity I have is to what extent this framework has been successful to encourage big transformations at the local level. How is it possible that the community influences corporate decisions?
I can jump in sort of briefly. So I think I mentioned Chile in my remarks, and so just to come back to that. So Jan's model, which I described we're using on the ground, our Chile team actually sort of took it one step further than we'd originally thought. And they actually, when they started engagement for this particular project, this permitting project, Lower Mate it's called, Jan's relationship, they turned it into a sort of a relationship wheel. And it became actually the framework for the meetings. So at the start of each meeting, they'd look at it and use that to help guide the meeting, to guide the dialogue. And it was really, really cool, really interesting. And so I think, I think that's a wonderful example of how his work, it's affecting lives directly on the ground. Another neat example of his tool was as they were starting baseline studies for this project, so flora, fauna, all the different kinds of things you do in an EIA. The team there, they had the community, so the consultants showed up, the engineers and biologists, and basically said, okay, stand back, we're going to start doing our work. But then it was, hang on a sec, we, the community, we're going to train you, the consultants, in what's important here in terms of flora, fauna, and other aspects. So it was a wonderful example of establishing the right balance of power in a relationship, and then really adding value, because the community was then involved in developing studies of which they knew a lot more than most other people.
That's perfect. It would be great to see that wheel, what's being used by the team there.
Okay, I think that I saw my phone. Sorry.
There you are.
Okay, I would like to go back to the first question, and I wanted to build up on what Luke was saying. The question was, what are the major issues with CSR, with different practices that are happening? I would say that the issue is not with CSR. It's what is the issue, or how are companies performing, and not only companies performing, but how are the rest of the stakeholders also seeing CSR? Because it's not only the company's responsibility as well, there are other stakeholders around it too that have an interest in a different way. So I would go beyond that, and other than, well, on top of the relationship, internal relationships that there have to happen, not to give the responsibility to only one department, how does that go beyond with the other stakeholders? So there's a pool of different stakeholders, and if you imagine a circle, and around this circle, all the different stakeholders, and if you have the company in the center, then everything goes to the company, and perhaps the issues and everything is pointing there. But if you move the company out of the circle and put it together with the rest of the stakeholders, and in the middle you put a common interest, then you can start working with the company to see what kind of solutions can come up to solve whatever problem that there is. It's also the responsibility of the company in terms of their goals and values, how they take CSR as well. How are they going to implement it through different standards, different ways of demonstrating that the company can do better, and if they don't have the knowledge, how can they check different standards or guidance like JANS to bring in that knowledge that perhaps is lacking, and then perform the way it should be. Yeah.
Thank you, Bernie. Well, I think there is no more questions, Karen, or there is one more?
Well, there's a couple more. I'm mindful of the time, though. What?
Yeah. We are almost at the limit of the time. But if you want, which one you would like to choose?
I'm just. I guess this is maybe one question that maybe some of you would know, was whether Jan covered sort of the no-go scenarios. Did he explore situations where the relationships were at a point where the project just couldn't go ahead, or at least not without some significant compromises in terms of the scope of plans? And have you seen that anywhere? And I guess what were the outcomes, if you have any?
Okay, who would like to answer that, Robert?
So he took snapshots at these 9 different cases, and there were some places where it wasn't moving ahead. So he had a good sampling in a variety. For example, I don't know if this was in his book or his thesis, the Rio Blanco in Peru. That's still not going ahead. It was bought by Xinjiang Metals, the Chinese company, but no, the polarization was so bad.
Yeah.
So,
yes, that's true, Karen. There are many projects that enter into a context that has been polarized for political parties or ideological things or previous negative aspects from previous mining experiences. So that's a no-go area. But I have seen also many cases where the no-go after a patient many years persistence and inspiring trust is possible to reactivate the relationship, but with different actors and different company profile. So this is something is possible, but you need to have time.
Right. Okay. I want to say thank you to all of you for being here today and presenting and spending some time and putting this content together and sharing your thoughts about all of it. So thank you so much. And I'll let Andres close.
Well, thank you. And also for your information, we are having this recording in part of the CIM Academy. Is correct, Karen?
Yeah.
Okay, this recording will be available on CIM website in the section is called Academy. So for anybody to look at it in his own pressure, and also we have the presentations available. Thank you very much, Robert, Bernie, Dominique, Luke, and Karen for giving us a chance, because really finding a spot in the very busy agenda for CIM. But anyway, I think we are benefiting from this legacy. And we keep doing this in the right direction to make mining industry more understandable and accepted. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.